How much?
How much you gotta spend?
Frank, this is more than a month's salary.
Out here, it is all about our hustle.
You really have to take us to the station.
I want to start by talking about the infuriating catch-22 that is the Madonna whore complex. Is that we have a dichotomy in this culture for thousands of years now, and I know that longtime listeners of the podcast are familiar with this trope as it gets trotted out over and over again, that divides women into two equally dismissible categories: whore, otherwise known as worldly women, mouthy women, public women. And I believe that Rudy Giuliani beautifully summed up the analysis that many people have when it comes to whores, talking about Stormy Daniels. Why would you listen to her? She is a whore. Now, the other side of that coin is the so-called respectable woman, otherwise known as virgin. But it's interesting that the defining characteristic of this woman is that she doesn't know anything. She is a childlike naivete person wandering helplessly out the world. So why the fuck would you listen to her? She's not allowed to see anything. And it comes from this basic idea that things that happen to men, even if they are difficult, even if they are challenging, make them better men, right? Men return back from war, better men. But women that go out and experience the world come back broken and damaged. So I describe myself as an unrepentant whore, but there are all kinds of us. We've had all kinds of experience, which means that there are people that have had traumatic or negative experiences in the sex work industry, or people who have had neutral or positive experiences in the sex work industry that have still later in life gone on to repent and seek to reform their experience in sex work. This month, we're beginning what I hope to be a recurring series on reformed whores. And we're going to begin with two iconic figures. Andrea Dworkin, iconic feminist writer and reformed whore, somebody who did prostitution as a survival sex worker and went on to diagnose pornography and sex work as the problem in a patriarchal culture, and iconic porn performer Linda Lovelace, who was lofted into the spotlight with the incredible breakthrough success of the famous film Deep Throat, and went from being a symbol of sexual liberation to being a symbol of the violent possession, the violent men possessing women. She goes on to repent, becoming a born-again Christian, and that is why we are picking these two powerhouse icons to begin our series on reformed whores. Both Andrea Dworkin and Linda Lovelace were born in the 1940s. Linda was born Linda Borman, January 10th, 1949, in the Bronx, New York. And Andrea Dworkin was born September 26, 1946, just a few miles away in Camden, New Jersey. They were both born to working-class families. Linda's father was a police officer, and her mother seems to be a raging cunt. I don't know much about Andrea Dworkin's mother, but I know that her father was a communist. Now, Andrea Dworkin points to several defining moments in her life: a rape that she experienced at the age of 9, and then getting arrested as an anti-Vietnam protester, where she underwent a traumatic and painful internal vaginal and anal cavity exam at the hands of the state, in what I believe, and I think that like any prison reform minded person believes, is an effort by the state to humiliate and degrade somebody for having the gall to protest what we now all collectively recognize to be an unjust and silly war. So those two events really shaped Andrea Dworkin. Linda Borman was also shaped by events in her life. At the age of 20, she had a child out of wedlock, locking her, in the eyes of her family, into the whore category of ladies. Her mother forced her to give that child up for adoption. And then she experienced a car accident. So she was emotionally and physically vulnerable when she met a man by the name of Chuck Traynor, who, by all accounts, was an abusive dickhead. Andrea Dworkin goes to Europe and finds her own abusive dickhead, who was a communist. But, we've all met liberally minded abusers. They exist amongst us. Yeah, conservatives do not have a monopoly on violent coercive control of women. That's the dude thing that has the full spectrum of political beliefs. So Andrea Dworkin leaves her abusive husband and engages in survival sex work, running away from the violence of her husband and into sort of like the anonymous violence of the very exploitative survival sex work, because desperate people do desperate things. And as we will see in both of these women's lives, the lack of social structures and the lack of social support available to women leaving their violently abusive husbands makes them vulnerable to exploitation. I don't believe that this is a personal failing of these women. I think this is on society for not creating space outside of the nuclear family ideal of like when you create dependency on a breadwinner and that breadwinner is an abusive dickhole, you're kind of SOL if you're not willing to break that narrative. So after Andrea Dworkin leaves her husband, engages in survival sex work, and becomes a writer, she begins to describe herself as a lesbian, but she's actually engaged in a long-term supportive relationship with a man who describes himself as not a man. Now, this is a moment in Andrea's life that she's mocked for in her lifetime, and she's mocked for after her death, of somebody who chooses to describe herself as a lesbian, making a political statement to distinguish herself from women that conform to the limitations of their gender role. And so she goes from one abusive relationship into a supportive relationship that is so contrary to the narrative provided to her of what a heterosexual relationship is supposed to look like, which is very much men possessing women legally and socially, right? We're not that far away from coverture as a legal concept, right? Where the assumption is that once a woman marries a man, his legal status covers her, which effectively means that she's not allowed to own or control any property, which is like cool, except that sometimes men drink. So she ends up in this long-term relationship, quietly marries this man who describes himself as not a man. She herself rejects the incredibly limiting narrative available to her as a woman, and instead describes herself as a lesbian, which in this context is a political statement, which means nonconformist and means something closer, I think, to pure partnership that we as millennials are bringing into the mainstream. So she is a pioneer of this kind of mutual egalitarian partnership with somebody who, although presents as a man, actively, consciously fights the coercive control that all of society is encouraging him to take. Linda has a different experience. Linda is stuck in a relationship with Chuck Traynor. She's been kicked out of her parents' home, being called a slut for having a child out of wedlock. He then leverages that slut shaming to force her into prostitution and forcing her even further and deeper into the trap of being a whore. So he forces her to engage. His introduction to prostitution is that he orchestrates a gang rape. He forces her into degrading pornography, bestiality. He's incredibly physically abusive and exerts all kinds of control over her life. Now, after introducing Linda to prostitution and to the seedy world of pornography, Chuck introduces her to a mob-funded film that became a cultural, iconic moment called Deep Throat. Now, this is a movie that it's written and produced by men, but it does in fact center female pleasure. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the, let's call it a plot of the film, the main character, Linda Lovelace, clitoris is it is deep in her throat instead of being on her body. But the journey of the movie is about this woman seeking sexual pleasure in its own right. Now, this is at a cultural moment when the novel Fear of Flying, which introduces the concept of the zipless fuck and the incredibly revolutionary idea that women enjoy sex in their own right, not just using it to trap men in marriage or trade it as a commodity. And the sexual revolution is very much underway in this moment. You have the pill has been around. Some Supreme Court decisions have led to recognizing women's sexual freedom and ability to have agency within sexual relationships. This is the beginning of the sex worker rights movement. Coyote is founded in 1972. We're just a few years away from the kickoff of the international sex worker rights movement in 1975, still celebrated on June 2nd every year as International Whores Day. There is a large conversation happening about the sexual agency of women, and the writers of this film capture a cultural moment and center a movie around the sexually liberated female that Linda Lovelace beautifully performs in this film. So it's difficult for me to overstate the cultural significance of Deep Throat. Just for some context, opening weekend, right? So before this film, pornography was something that happened in CD theaters, presumably covered in like common cigarette smoke, right? You had to like walk through like gross small theaters, shameful places that you would not bring a date, places that you would not talk about at a dinner party in mixed company. There's this like veil of shame. And pornography is, people think of them as the place of like perverts and grossness. Deep Throat is a comedy. It becomes a date night movie. Just for some context, opening weekend, Deep Throat makes more money than Casablanca. That's the kind of cultural moment we're talking about. Now, all of a sudden, Deep Throat is being discussed on late night television. It's being covered in the news, and it's bringing this iconic figure, right? The sexually liberated woman into conversations that are happening in living rooms all over the country. Now, the problem with this is that people don't fit neatly into boxes. And Linda Lovelace, as a cultural iconic figure, is supposed to be this happy hooker, the liberated whore, right? Now, of course, she's being slut-shamed by her family. Of course, pundits on television are disgusted by her immorality. Behind the scenes, she's getting the shit beaten out of her by her husband, and she's engaged in a deeply exploitative industry. I don't mean pornography and sex work, I mean the entertainment industry. Deep Throat makes $300 million in 1972, and Linda Lovelace is paid $1,250, or more accurately, because of the power dynamics of her relationship on a micro level and also the legal dynamics of marriage in 1972, every cent of that gets spent by her husband on God knows what. This is not the first time that we've seen this story, right? When Marilyn Monroe created the Playboy brand, she got paid $50 for the nude photographs that ended up creating an existential threat to her career while putting money in Hugh Hefner's pocket. So Chuck Traynor has already forced Linda into prostitution. He's beating her throughout the duration of the film. But after the success of the movie, the violence actually increases. Linda somehow gathers the emotional and financial strength to leave her husband and divorces him in 1974. Now, she goes on to marry a man named Larry Macchiano, who is another working class guy. They have 2 children together, but the relationship doesn't last and they divorce in 1996. Now, she describes this relationship as also abusive. And in 1980, she publishes an autobiography called Ordeal that radically shifts the narrative of her like iconic role as the happy, sexually liberated, empowered woman to being a victim of domestic violence. Now, this book is met with skepticism. So much skepticism, in fact, that her publishers force her to take a polygraph test to prove that the abuse allegations that she levels against Chuck Traynor are in fact real. Never mind that you can see the bruises in the movie, but and that also people on set remember hearing her getting beaten. But you know, when it's between a husband and wife, it's a private matter. So what can you do? 1980, she publishes this book reframing her experience as a porn performer from one of whore, right, self-empowered woman who chose this work, to hapless victim. And she's met with a great deal of skepticism. They ask the same question that domestic violence victims continue to be asked to this day. Why didn't you leave? And I think the answer in Linda's case is that not only was there no social support, right? Her family did not support her. The culture that she lived in did not support her. There were no domestic violence shelters. She had no legal rights to any money. And also the narratives that are available to her do not support her leaving her husband. But she does that. She gathers the strength to do that. And a cultural moment where the sex worker rights movement is just brushing up against what we're going to call radical feminism. So Andrea Dworkin has published many books at this point. The 1970s, she is being lofted into a cultural role of an anti-prostitution feminist, but it's not just anti-prostitution, it's anti-sex. She rejects heteronormative sexual behavior. She reframes all heterosexual unions as being men possessing women. And the thing about Andrea Dworkin's analysis at this cultural moment, she's not wrong. If you look at the legal structure of marriage, if you look at the way that women are forced into a dependent role on a sole breadwinner that has all kinds of legal and physical control over their dependents, including women and children, we turn women into these childlike creatures within the structure of the Madonna whore complex, right? Because again, when society says whore, they often mean public woman or woman in public or woman that has the gall to participate in the public discourse. So Andrea Dworkin rejects this, and Linda has to make a narrative choice, right, between two dichotomous things. And I think this is part of like a psychological schism that has plagued not just Linda, but I think many women that try to process their sexual trauma, right? Because there are only two very flattened, limiting narratives that are available to them. Either they wanted it, they asked for it, they encouraged it, and they profited from it, or they are childlike, helpless victims led astray by a big bad wolf. There's no space for multidimensional, complex people making choices within a context. And so Linda Lovelace is again lofted into celebrity, but this time she becomes a born-again Christian figurehead representing the unholy matrimony between radical feminism and the moral majority that wants to erase sex and sexual agency from women from the public sphere, and ironically ends up advocating for exactly the kind of familial structure that her and Andrea were victims of. The moral majority and the Christian coalition is interested in solidifying and cementing this nuclear family model that deprives women and children from agency in public life. And they are using the anti-porn movement and the victimization that Linda experienced and Andrea experienced within the sex industry to hate on sex and hate on the sex industry when the real problem has always been toxic masculinity and patriarchy. And my question to anyone that listens to Linda Lovelace's story and comes away with an anti-pornography position is, if Chuck Traynor was forcing Linda Lovelace to work as a waitress at gunpoint, would you be against the food and bev industry? The problem here is coercive control. It's not the sex industry in its entirety. And there are ways to encourage agency, to encourage autonomy, and to encourage freedom of choice within exploitative industries, but it involves re-examining the social structures that contribute to the lack of choice that Linda suffered from. Andrea Dworkin is the radical feminist face on the feminist movement of the 1970s that starts to take an anti-sex turn, right? They join forces with Linda Lovelace to begin this national campaign, and they actually try to promote legislation criminalizing pornography. And I think that they are aptly called censors. They want censorship, right? And so in the name of freeing women from, I don't know, the shackles of sexual imagery, they actively promote legislation that would prevent and criminalize people, including women, from participating in the porn industry. And they end up creating a very powerful opponent that I think does a lot of damage to the sex worker rights movement, right? So again, 1972, Coyote is well underway. The sex worker rights movement is beginning internationally. You have an army of mouthy whores who are advocating for their own agency within this industry. And there are some nascent unionization attempts that would actually give porn performers, male and female, more power to negotiate less exploitative relationships with producers. But then this unholy alliance of like Andrea Dworkin with Linda Lovelace presenting herself as a victim of this exploitative industry creates a powerful enemy in the form of Hustler and Playboy and the male owners, like brothel owners and porn producers and men who possess women in this deeply exploitative industry. So you end up disempowering workers from being able to advocate for themselves by turning this into a porn versus women fight, instead of this being women in all of their complexity, with all of their sexual preferences, with all of their different relationships to sex, versus men seeking to control them. Whether the men seeking to control them are their husbands, their fathers, porn producers, brothel owners, or the Hugh Hefners of the world. Both Andrea and Linda die young. Andrea Dworkin dies at the age of 58. Complications with myocarditis. She doesn't have good health. And Linda Borman, who suffered from Hep C, which she got from a blood transfusion from the car accident that made her so vulnerable to Chuck Traynor's advances, dies in another car accident at the age of 53, April 22nd, 2002. Both of these women had complex, fascinating lives. They tried to tell their own story, but because of the virgin whore dichotomy, the victim-villain dichotomy, and this idea that we can divide the world into two categories of people, neither of these women were heard. Thank you so much for listening. This has been The Oldest Profession.